Post-Aristotelian Ancient Philosophy, Part 10, The Dark Ages in Europe. Professor Michael Botwin, Department of Psychology, California State University, Fresno. We could ask the Jerry Seinfeld-like question, what really happened during the Dark Ages? And I find it a particularly fascinating time in the history of Western Europe. There are many changes, significant political, social changes. The religious order changed. Lots and lots of stuff changed. The problem is there wasn't a whole lot of documentation. Things were really not doing well for a long period of time. And the new Europe that resulted in medieval and Renaissance times after the Dark Ages was radically different than what was going on as Europe went into the so-called Dark Ages. There was a lot of good stuff going on. There was a lot of development going on. A lot of important, significant changes. There was some really bad stuff too. But it wasn't as bleak as people, even a few years ago, used to portray it as. Europe primarily was agrarian, and there were significant changes to the social order. First of all, after Constantine declares Christianity the Church of Rome, Rome starts to collapse upon itself. And when you look at various scholars and their ideas of when Rome fell, anytime between 410, 529, the Common Era. And actually, Rome didn't just suddenly collapse. You can see it took over 100 years to do so. First of all, there were some major divisions that we still see today. Over time, the central Roman authority fell, and you first get two major governing bodies. You get the Roman Empire run out of Italy, and then you get the Byzantine Roman Empire running out of what is now Istanbul, Turkey. In its day, it was Constantinople. And actually, the Eastern Empire stood far longer than the Western Roman Empire did. But gradually, Central Rome lost its authority, and you saw the rise of states and cities throughout Europe that became relatively independent. You also have the rise of Catholic dogma. Now, what you have to remember about this time is that the church had a significant amount of authority in Europe. Far more authority than any religious organization does in control of things in the present day. The Roman Church, the Catholic Church, if you would, depending on how you see that, essentially became the glue that held Europe together. It was where all learned people were. There weren't any universities yet. Those weren't to emerge until the late Dark Ages, around 1000 or so. So all learning, all knowledge was kept by the church in monasteries in Rome at St. Peter's. And to this day, the Catholic Church has massive archives outlining these things. Now, the Roman Church was highly, highly influential. It could excommunicate a king and turn the rest of Europe against them. There was, for a considerable amount of time, a empire supported by the Catholic Church, the Holy Roman Empire. And that played a significant role in European politics for an extremely long period of time. Even as the feudal system started to develop into Europe, and you got local lords and local countries that started forming that make the basis of our modern map of Europe, the church still owned a considerable amount of land, had massive amounts of wealth. Furthermore, the church had the right to tax people, just as the government does. Now, you would be taxed by the church just like you would be taxed by the government. So you would imagine we send our money into the IRS into Sacramento, but you'd also get a tax bill from the church that you were required to pay. Now, with that in mind, you can see where during the Dark Ages and the beginning of the medieval period and Renaissance, where you get these massive Gothic cathedrals and all those type things, well, the church was getting tons of money from its constituents. And you have to remember, it wasn't until much, much later that Martin Luther came along and formed the Protestant Reformations in the late period of medieval, early Renaissance Europe. So the church played a major, major role in how people thought and how people behaved. Probably the most deadly thing that happened during the Dark Ages were a series of waves of the Bubonic Plague. And the Bubonic Plague came in from other places. Typically, it's attributed to rats being infected on cargo ships and carrying it into cities. But there was no cure. It moved rapidly. It didn't consider social class, whether you were a king or a serf or a peasant. If it was around and you succumbed to it, you died typically a horrible death within 3 days. People were so afraid of the Bubonic Plague that they left family members that had it to their own ends to die. Depending on who you look at and who you read, a moderate estimate is that 1/3 of the entire population of Europe died during the plague. In some areas that was considerably higher. In many areas it wasn't much out of the realm to consider that 50% of the population died of the plague. I have a coughing dog in the background here giving you some thematic sound effects. I guarantee you he doesn't have the plague. He's just got hay fever. So the plague wipes out 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe. Imagine what that would do to our current population if 1/3 to 1/2 of the people died. And the plague was so rampant that... Pippin, stop that. Come on. We don't need that many sound effects. Was so rampant that entire cities were abandoned and went back to nature. People were afraid to contact each other. Strangers were seen as potential bearers of the plague and shunned. it was a horrendous time. And if you've ever read anything about the plague and heard about the devastation and the effects it had on Europe. Now, the plague happened in other places too. There were outbreaks in Africa, the Mideast, and the Far East. But like I said, we're focusing in this class on Western Europe. So imagine a third to half of everybody just gone within a short period of time. It really devastated Europe. And in some ways, it was seed for social change during the Renaissance. It allowed the development of the merchant and craftsman classes. There is another significant thing, especially for our story of the history of psychology, that happened during the Dark Ages into the Middle Ages. Stop that. And that was the Crusades. Originally, the Crusades were started as an effort to regain the Holy Land back from the Muslims, who were considered the infidels. And there were several Crusades that happened, starting in 1095, ending in 1291. And in some cases, it was done for extremely mercenary reasons. It was to go to capture lands and riches. In other cases, some of the Crusades were set up in a more pragmatic way. After the 100 Years' War, there were lots of mercenaries running around rampant through France. And one of the popes thought it would be a good idea to send all of these military guys who knew no other trade, because they'd been fighting all their lives to do some good, as they thought, sent them to the Holy Land to recapture Jerusalem. And the Crusaders built an empire that lasted several hundred years in the Mideast. And their invasion, which if you talk to the Muslims will be an invasion, essentially is the root of some of the problems that we still have today, not only in the Mideast, but with Mideast and Western relations. Now, militaries operated very, very differently than they do today. Standing armies didn't come around until the 1600s. Up until that time, everything was pretty much mercenaries or feudal lords who called upon their lesser nobles to supply men and arms for battle. And one of the typical ways soldiers were rewarded during that time was to what they would call sack a town, which is basically, after it's captured, go in and totally rob all of the people there, take all of their possessions, and oftentimes devastate the population in very heinous ways. So a itinerant knight, not a really rich guy, might see his road to wealth and fame and fortune by taking on the task of doing a crusade. So many of them went to the Mideast, and they brought back with them tales of the unusual things they found there, including a lot of foods and including lots of other interesting things that they stole and brought back. Now, during the period of the Dark Ages, many of the Greek scholars migrated to the Mideast, where knowledge was still valued. In fact, later in this set of lectures, we'll talk about how the period of Dark Ages in Europe was actually a period of Renaissance in the Mideast. Books were extremely rare. Remember, up until Gutenberg comes along in the 1500s, all books are hand copied. So they're extremely valuable. It was also the Muslim custom to decorate books with jewels, fine leather bindings, and things like that. So books were worth a lot of money, and a lot of the knights brought them back. Now remember, as we started developing in one of the previous lectures, early Christianity is based on Platonic theory. We get to the return of the Crusaders. They bring back, guess who? Aristotle. After being out of favor with most of his works lost in Dark Ages Europe, the Crusaders bring back the knowledge that had been developed by the Arabs, especially the philosophy of Aristotle, which had been out of favor with the Catholic Church. And one of the things that we'll do as we move through this next unit is show how Aristotle was reintroduced and became back in favor in medieval Europe. And we'll find out about that in our future lectures in the history of psychology. See you next time. This has been a We Have Couches video production. Copyright 2020. Professor Michael Botwin. All rights reserved.